The chat is open, as you've seen, so if you could share where you are calling in from if you haven't already done so. We will field questions at the end of the presentation, so just keep that in mind for questions that might be coming into the chat. Josh will certainly answer those at the end after we get through the material. You can either post those questions into the chat, or if you do want to take yourself off mute, you certainly could do that as well. So make sure that we are doing that. Thank you for those, if this is your first session that you've joined with us for our Cyber Week that we're running this week, or if you've attended some of the other ones. I know we have another one right after this, so keep an eye out. If you're not registered for that one, that will also be a fantastic session. And all of these sessions have been recorded, or most of them have been recorded, so you can certainly check those out if you've missed any on our YouTube channel. And from here, what I will do is I will certainly stop talking and I will pass it over to our presenter and WGU alumni, Josh. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much, RJ, and welcome everyone for those of you that are here with us today, and then anyone who's going to watch this afterwards on demand. Thank you very much for being with us, and to WGU for the opportunity to present. As RJ mentioned, I am a graduate of WGU as well, with a master's in information security and assurance. So today I'm going to be talking to you about defending critical infrastructure against cyber attacks, and this is something that worldwide has become an ever-increasing problem that we're seeing of adversaries going after critical infrastructure. And I'm going to talk to you today about what critical infrastructure is, things that you can do to prevent attacks against it, and just the kinds of attacks that we're seeing. Just brief background on me. I've been doing cybersecurity now for over 20 years. I got my start in law enforcement when I created a high-tech crimes unit, and eventually was the commander of an FBI cyber crimes task force, and as a municipal officer assigned to that task force, and I ended up leading that for about 7 of my 11 years in law enforcement. I then left and went to Las Vegas, which actually was where I was born. I had left and then came back. I saw somebody in the chat was from Las Vegas as well, where I was the Chief Information Security Officer and eventually the Chief Information Officer, or the CIO, of the Nevada National Security Site, part of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex, where I had global purview over all the cybersecurity and eventually all the IT there. I worked at Gartner for a while as an executive partner for several years, advising federal government and DoD, Department of Defense executives on IT, security and risk, leadership, things like that. And then most recently, I was the Senior Vice President of Operations at the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, where, if you've heard of the CIS controls and the CIS benchmarks, that's where I worked. But I led the operations side of the house, which was the 24/7 Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or MSISAC, as well as the Elections Infrastructure ISAC, and was responsible for a cooperative agreement between CIS and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. And then now I have my own cybersecurity advisory and consulting business called Natsar, and I am based in Saratoga Springs, New York. And with that backdrop, I next want to set the stage of what it is we'll be talking about for the rest of the time that we are together today. And what exactly is critical infrastructure, and the things that we are seeing, as I mentioned, those kinds of attacks that are happening. So when I mention critical infrastructure, it's really any physical or virtual asset, a system, network, etc., but it's got to be vital to the security, economy, public health, and the welfare of a jurisdiction. And part 2 of that is that their presence, or what they do, is so vital that if they were incapacitated or destroyed, it would have a significant impact on national security, economic stability, public health, or safety. So that's a pretty generic definition of critical infrastructure, but one of the things I have been able to do in my career is teach and go advise other countries on cybersecurity all over the world, and this is a pretty general definition that I see even across the world of the kinds of things that different countries, including the United States, are dealing with when it comes to critical infrastructure. Some examples of what types of sectors are in critical infrastructure, and again, this varies a little bit by jurisdiction. But we have things like chemical and manufacturing plants, communications facilities and telecommunications, so internet and phone and cell sites, et cetera. Defense industrial base, so those organizations that are creating products and services for the military, emergency services like police and fire and EMS, energy and utilities, so certainly your power grid, your natural gas, your water and wastewater treatment. The financial services sector certainly is part of this. Food and agricultural, government services and facilities, healthcare, IT, nuclear, either weapons or nuclear power plants, water, wastewater treatment, and dams, and then transportation. So obviously that's a lot of organizations and entities and agencies that would fall under critical infrastructure. Most likely, many of you may be working in some sort of entity that would be considered critical infrastructure. So there's a lot of organizations that have these titles and also have some specific targets on them because they are part of a critical infrastructure sector. Now, the other thing that we are seeing is this landscape shift, not only in cyber attacks, but just the kinds of technologies that are being deployed across the country, across the world, when it comes to managing these critical infrastructure businesses, organizations, agencies, et cetera. So this is actually a picture I took of the Idaho National Lab in Idaho in the United States. It was one of the very first facilities where nuclear energy was used to power a light bulb. And there's a museum there that this is the actual equipment. It was left untouched when they turned this down in a museum in the Department of Energy's Idaho National Lab. This is the kind of facility and equipment and things that we would see in the 50s and 60s and a little bit later when it came to critical infrastructure. So it's very much a closed system, certainly not connected to the internet. And this is the kind of control stations you would see in some sort of facility like that. But now it's gone from that to this. And this is the kind of thing that we are seeing today. If you were to go into your power company, for instance, or any type of utility company, generally they're going to have a control room that looks like this. It's almost like a security operations center, and everything's computerized and everything's connected to the internet, at least in this part, hopefully not all of their operational technology. But it really is much more sophisticated, which has led to a lot of enhancements. But of course, it's also led to a number of vulnerabilities and things that we as cybersecurity professionals have to think about, look at, and deal with to make sure that the organization stays secure. Now, part of that too is us going to, you see the industrial revolutions over the years. Well, at this point, we're really in Industry 4.0. And this is where we start layering in things that is new to operational technology, industrial control systems, and those kinds of operations. So certainly automation and augmented reality and all the systems being able to talk to each other, Internet of Things or IoT devices and robotics and cloud computing. These are all things that are really interesting and have scaled organizations quite well and have provided new capabilities that never existed before. However, every one of these also may cause some sort of vector for an adversary to be able to get into these organizations. There's a number of cybersecurity challenges that critical infrastructure organizations face. It's really not just critical infrastructure. Many organizations face these, but I wanted to go through them in a little more detail. But this is particularly relevant to critical infrastructure because, especially when we talk about the skills gap, it's hard enough finding cybersecurity professionals that have training and experience in doing just general cybersecurity, blue team and red team and that kind of work. But then you layer on top of it the speciality of operational technology and industrial control systems and understanding the different protocols and the types of equipment that's being used and how to allow people remote access in a secure way to some of those things is certainly a specialized skill that many even cybersecurity professionals don't have, let alone IT individuals and other people. And so sometimes you see these critical infrastructure organizations think they're doing the right thing, or they are they have good intentions. They want to be able to have somebody at home remote into a SCADA controller and turn something on or off, and they don't think it's any big deal to connect it to the city's network or the county's network or the business network, but it ends up being a huge deal. And this skills gap is causing a challenge globally when it comes to especially critical infrastructure. Then number two, we see this expanding attack surface, and attack surface management is already challenging for any organization. But then when you layer on to an IT network and an OT network and just employees going to the cloud with things that may or may not be approved by the organization, and mobile devices and software as a service, you see number three, this causes additional challenges for cybersecurity experts because it's not just the castle and the moat where they're trying to secure everything in the facility behind the corporate firewall. They now have to secure everything, whether it's a mobile device or on-prem or in a data center somewhere or the commercial cloud. So it just takes more experience, more training, more tooling to be able to secure those kinds of environments. And then we see number four, the digital supply chain. So this not only are concerns like we saw with SolarWinds and Microsoft and other attacks where the actual software itself or some sort of update or a process in the software created a vulnerability that somebody could exploit, but also even counterfeit equipment. So maybe network switches or routers or other things that have been intentionally injected with some sort of a backdoor or some way for someone to either monitor that or have data sent off. We see that for two reasons. We see sometimes counterfeit devices just because someone's trying to make money by selling something that says it's Cisco, but it's really not. So just like we see with counterfeit materials and things. But then the second primary reason is where we see especially nation state sponsored actors who are interjecting themselves into the supply chain and actually making those devices capable for them to be able to access a network. And then that really leads us to number five, where we have sophisticated adversaries. We are seeing the types of attacks, like I mentioned, supply chain is one example, but other attacks that are really sophisticated that even well-equipped, resourced, and trained cyber defense teams are having a difficult time catching some of these attacks that are going on. Oh, one slide too many. I mentioned the expansion of the attack surface, and this is just a graphic that shows a little bit what I'm talking about. In the center there, we've had the traditional perimeter. So you really have endpoints and servers and a data center, and the servers are in the data center. The endpoints are, desktop computers, maybe some laptops, and that's largely what most individuals kind of grew up on. But then we started having this more modern perimeter where you have mobile devices, you have to worry about identity and access management more, you have applications that may live outside of your data center, and then websites and databases and things like that that are being interacted with. And then now we have really this opening of the perimeter even more. So the supply chain things I mentioned, the IoT, what do you do with thermostats and refrigerators and televisions and all these smart devices that could even be on business networks, and how are those being secured? Even printers and things like that. And all sorts of other things that are having to be discussed, data moving between some things that you may own, some things that somebody else owns, and having to understand who's responsible for what. And then on the right-hand side at the bottom of that expanding perimeter is this whole cyber physical component where you're now controlling physical devices through some sort of cyber means. It could be an elevator, an escalator, the floodgates on a dam. It could be releasing chemicals into the water treatment facility. It could be the power grid. But this is where things get really interesting and really scary, is when you have those cyber physical components being merged, and especially if they're not being secured properly or monitored properly, it can really lead to some bad consequences, some of which I'm going to share with you in just a bit. The types of adversaries that critical infrastructure and really other organizations face primarily include cyber criminals, so individuals that are committing crimes through cyber means, state actors, so this is where you have countries hacking other countries, and it's generally military organizations or other sophisticated units that are going after an organization. Hacktivists, so these are the types of individuals you may think of like Anonymous or others that hack some victim because of a perceived social injustice or some other reason where they're trying to make a statement with their cyber activity. Insider threats, where you see somebody on the inside either accidentally or maliciously causing some sort of cyber incident. It could be just creating an unnecessary vulnerability that's later exploited by somebody else, or it could be they're actually launching ransomware inside, they're stealing data, they're doing something intentionally to shut down an organization. And then the opportunistic hackers. And these are the individuals that, kind of like if you think about your neighborhood and there's, let's say, a bunch of cars parked along the street and somebody's walking by and trying the door handles of the cars. If they find one that's unlocked, they're probably going to go in, root around, and see what they can find. They didn't necessarily target that car. It was just a crime of opportunity. And we certainly see that in cyber, where you have adversaries that are just scanning the internet and networks to see what they can find. And if they find something to exploit, they will give it a try. Another statistic that's a little startling here is that 87% of organizations know they suffered a cyber incident in the past 18 months. It's pretty remarkable when you think of 87% said, yes, we know we've had a cyber incident in the past 18 months. Now, to make that even more scary, 65% of the 87% said, not only do we have a cyber incident, but we suffered some sort of data spillage, meaning there was a breach. We lost PII or PHI or our proprietary information or classified material or whatever it was, or their systems were crippled. So maybe it was a denial of service attack, a ransomware attack, but it had a major business impact. So we see the severity and the complexity and just the frequency of cyber attacks continue to increase. Some of you, this is probably a review for, and some of you maybe not. I know there's people that are watching this that are cyber professionals. There's other people that you're going to school to become full-time cyber professional. But one thing that's just important to remember is the concept of the cyber kill chain and how it plays into what we're talking about. So remember, our job, especially on the cyber defense side, is to try and catch an adversary as far to the left of this chain as possible. So you have them doing things like reconnaissance, where they are scanning networks, doing social media investigations or OSINT, open source intelligence reviews of employees. They're trying to find everything out they can about their target. Then they weaponize something based on what they found during reconnaissance, and then they deliver that, whether it's a phishing attack, most of the time, about 90% or so, these seem to be, or some other way. It could just be a crafted exploit that they go after a vulnerability that they found on a system. Then, of course, they exploit their target through whatever they weaponized. And then they have the goal of maintaining persistence. They want to be able to survive in that network and have a foothold. And sometimes they do that just in RAM of a system. They don't want to have persistence on the disk because they think they may not get caught if they stay just in RAM, which is something we're seeing a little bit more of. Or they get on the hard drive of a computer that maybe clicked a link and gain persistence there and then try and do another bit of reconnaissance on the inside of the network. So then they do command and control, and this is where the adversary actually can issue commands to the compromised system and have it do whatever it is they're asking. And then finally, their action to the objective. Now, it could just be they are trying to get access to be a remote access broker where they compromise a network. They have really no interest in the network, but what they do is they post on the dark web, I've got access to the following organizations. And then other people buy that access from the broker to then launch an attack because they do have an interest in that particular organization. Or it could be they're trying to exploit the organization for money through ransomware, or they're trying to steal data, or whatever their objective is. This is the time that they do that. And then this whole cycle can start over again once they have more access inside to more things to see. Critical infrastructure attacks specifically are increasing across the world. In fact, in 2023, the world's critical infrastructure experienced 13 cyber attacks every single second. 13 attacks every second. And this is up 30% just from 2022. So definitely critical infrastructure has a target. That's why I selected this topic to talk about when I was asked by WGU to come speak with you, just because I think it's really important, but also as cyber defenders, knowing how much of a target critical infrastructure is really good for us to just always keep in the back of our mind. The other thing is critical infrastructure cyber attacks are life-threatening. There was a prediction by Gartner that by 2025, attackers will have weaponized a cyber physical system to successfully harm or kill humans. There's certainly been attacks like this already, and we have seen attempts going on, and I'll highlight one in just a little bit that has been especially designed to try and inflict bodily harm and death among people. So when you think about things like too much chemicals being put into the water treatment of a city, or the power grid going down completely, or we saw the Colonial Pipeline, which we'll talk about it a little bit too. I mean, it could be death from second and third order of effects, like not having heat in the winter or not having electricity for so long that people can't keep their food cold or their medical devices don't work. Or it could be something like it causes an explosion, like we see on the slide here. And just that primary impact has the ability to kill people. The other thing we see is critical infrastructure attacks are profitable. Now, not for us, but certainly for the adversaries. In fact, in 2023, ransomware attackers received $1.1 billion. And this is because the adversaries know that critical infrastructure organizations are more likely to pay the ransom because they've just got to get back in the service. So if their targets are things like financial institutions or hospitals or cities or counties or states, they all have things they have to get done, and they can't be down for too long. So in many cases, they'll pay. In many cases, they also have cyber insurance, which may or may not help pay some of those ransoms. And the ransomware actors certainly know that information. And speaking of ransomware, this is certainly the attack of choice that we see across critical infrastructure, really, obviously more than just critical infrastructure, but we definitely see it being targeted there. Some examples: attackers of the recent United Healthcare attack received $22 million from their ransomware attack. The Colonial Pipeline that I mentioned earlier, that attack, they received $5 million. We had that attack a couple of years ago with the meat packer JBS plants in the United States, and they received $11 million. The average ransomware payment across the world was $2 million. So if you think that's just the average worldwide, and these attackers are going after organizations across the world, they are making a lot of money if the average is a $2 million payout. Now, when it comes specifically to these IT, OT environments, SCADA systems, industrial control systems, there are malware variants that are produced specifically to go after those kinds of systems. Here's just a couple of them that have been developed that are a little bit more well known. The first one is the Industrier 2, and this is really designed to target those field controllers and other ICS systems. Their main goal is to cause impact to high voltage electrical substations. And we saw this being used against power grids in Ukraine. The Black Energy 3 is a Trojan used in phishing campaigns. This targets SCADA systems, supervisory control, and data acquisition systems specifically. So a lot of times those are dealing with water facilities, dams, and other critical infrastructure. The Triton or Trisys malware is designed to stop or run programs that use the Tri-Station protocol. We've seen this dubbed the world's most murderous malware, and the most notable attack from this was the petrochemical plant in Saudi Arabia. And then the last one, Pipe Dream, this one is highly capable, and it's designed to manipulate industrial control programming logic controllers, or PLCs. and other industrial software. So the PLCs are those things that really go between whatever the mechanical part is and the computer, and it allows commands to be sent, and then it creates some sort of physical action based on that. So when those are targeted, that's where you get the floodgates going up, the injection of chemicals or things like that that can be life-threatening. So here's a couple specific examples that we have seen in critical infrastructure, and some of these highlight some shortcomings of their cyber defense teams as well. So the first one, United Health, affected millions of people. It was a ransomware attack against one of the largest health payment processing companies. If you remember a couple months ago, pharmacies couldn't fill orders. Hospitals had to stop seeing patients for a while. They couldn't accept credit card payments. It was just a real mess. And it's one of those things that continues to show us how reliant we are on the internet and everything being connected together, and also how vulnerable we are to things like this. This attack created a backlog of unpaid medical claims and actually affected 94% of US doctors. So you really see how many people were involved in some way with this attack. 150 million patient records were compromised. United Healthcare paid $22 million in ransom. And Black Cat is the organization that took credit for this. The other problem with this, and one of the shortcomings from the cyber defense perspective, was there was no multi-factor authentication in use. So once they obviously got the credentials, they were able to get in and do this much damage, mostly because MFA was just not being used. The second one I mentioned a little bit ago about the Ukraine power grid and some of the malware that was used on there. This one is a 2015 cyber attack. It resulted in outages of more than 200,000 customers. This is that malware, the Black Energy 3, was specifically crafted and used for this by the threat actor Sandworm. We saw this attack unfold by corporate networks were first compromised with malware from a phishing attack. So you wonder, well, how would a system that's on the internet and communicating with email get compromised and then be able to cross over to this OT network? And that's a great question. And that's the problem with this convergence is people get a little bit sloppy sometimes out of the need for speed or for convenience, and they end up creating vulnerabilities like this where something could come from the internet to a system and then get into a network like this. Files were deleted with kill disk. Denial of service attacks happened afterwards, and it even disabled their emergency backup generators. So you can see this certainly has a threat to life and to a number of other things, the financial sector, food, all sorts of things, just because the power was out, and especially when they take out the backup generators as well. The third one I have here is the Saudi Arabia plan. I mentioned this one too a little bit ago, and this is one that we saw in 2014, but it wasn't discovered until 2017. So that's a dwell time of 3 years, and we usually see average dwell times, meaning how long an adversary is in a network before they're discovered, of around a year. So this one was particularly long. This particular attacker used the Triton malware. They made access again through the IT network and then were able to get into the OT network. They targeted controllers specifically made by Schneider Electric. And this could have been catastrophic. In fact, it was designed to be catastrophic. It was designed to release toxic gases and create explosions. But luckily, there was a flaw in the way the malware was written that triggered a safety system response. So it drew attention to something going on. They didn't know initially that it was malware that was causing this, but they were able to shut down the processes that were being implemented by the malware to prevent this from happening. And this is the first ever malware found that was intentionally developed to put human lives at risk. So when we go back to that Gartner study, by 2025, there will be life lost as a result of critical infrastructure attacks. I think we have already seen that. We know for sure, for example, in COVID time, and even since then, 2021, 2022, we saw ransomware attackers going after hospitals, shutting them down completely. The hospitals had to divert patients. Some patients died as a result. I think you could articulate that that was as a result of the cyber attack. So we're definitely seeing that, but now even scaled up more where they're really going after hospitals and other critical infrastructure to get their payout. And then we have the Colonial Pipeline. So this is a 2021 attack. We probably, anybody who remembers this, probably, especially if you were in line to get gas, you definitely remember this. But this was a targeted ransomware attack against the U.S. oil pipeline company, Colonial Pipeline. This particular company supplied 45% of the East Coast gas and diesel and jet fuel. There were 11,000 gas stations that just totally ran out of fuel. The attackers, known as the Dark Side, stole more than 100 gigabytes of data from this company, and eventually Colonial paid $5 million to get their systems back online. But as a result of this attack, gas in the US rose to the highest it has been or had been at the time for over 6 years. And this is another example of the problem with leaked credentials. So the way this one unfolded was the credentials for this system that was attacked had been breached in a separate data breach and posted. So the adversaries found these credentials for Colonial Pipeline in a separate data breach, then used them against Colonial Pipeline in this attack. So it makes you wonder, why didn't they have multi-factor authentication? How often are they changing their passwords? Why didn't they know their credentials were out on the dark web? Lots of questions there, but the impact this had was on even all of us. It rose the price of gas. And we also have seen cases where private companies are hacked that are publicly traded, and it does tremendous problems driving their stock down. It can upset the entire financial market, even sometimes just based on a rumor of an attack. We've also seen mis and disinformation from foreign countries talking about the fact that somebody was hacked, and the stocks went down just to find out it actually never really even happened. So the mis and disinformation is a whole separate topic, but certainly something that we are watching closely in the context of critical infrastructure. Some common risks that we see in critical infrastructure environments are things like just the lack of network visibility. One of the things I do in my company now is risk assessments and vulnerability assessments. And I go into companies, and especially ones that have some sort of critical infrastructure going on, and I talk to them about things like the NIST cybersecurity framework or the CIS controls or whatever framework that I'm using or that they've asked me to use. And there are so many times when they just don't have any visibility. I got called in to do a incident response case a couple of weeks ago in a hospital, and it was a large hospital, and I was pretty disappointed in the lack of logs that they had. So it was difficult for me to do my job because they weren't logging nearly what they should have been logging. So visibility is key. There's also just a large number of unmitigated vulnerabilities. You scan the network for vulnerabilities and you find unpatched vulnerabilities that have been there for over a year. And it's just, it's no wonder that they're getting compromised when you see things like that. They have no access or no asset control. The old saying, you cannot protect what you don't know exists, is totally correct. You have to know what's on your network, what software you have, what hardware you have. They have no formalized incident response plan. One of the things I do typically for organizations, I do tabletop exercises. I give them a scenario. I have all their executives in the room, and most of the time it's a painful lesson to them on how unprepared they really are. But that's great, because that's the whole point of doing it. You don't want to be building the airplane as you fly it. Let's practice this stuff ahead of time. There's this network convergence. So you've got IT and OT together, but there's no network segmentation. There's no proper security between them. We've already seen why that's a problem in multiple areas. Default credentials, admin, password, or they have weak credentials that are easily brute forced, or they share them. You go into the office and you see the password to the system, on a sticky note or put on the wall or written on the whiteboard. Those things still happen today. They have no security operations center in many cases. They have internet connectivity within high-risk environments. They have unsecure remote access. This I see a lot, where they get a vendor to sell them some sort of equipment, and the vendor says, oh, by the way, you can just plug this into the internet, and then you can sit at home and do what you need to do. And they think, oh, that's great. Probably the vendors figured out how to secure this. Well, they haven't. It's just literally just sitting out there on the internet. No firewall, no segmentation, no monitoring, no antivirus. So obviously you want to be on the lookout for things like that. No baseline configuration controls, meaning you're not hardening your systems to things like the CIS benchmarks or the DISA STIGs or things like that. They've got legacy or unsupported software or hardware in their environment, and then just overall a lack of what we call basic cyber hygiene, those basic things that you really should be doing no matter your industry, your organization, etc. So one thing I really want to, well, I'm switching now to things I want to leave you with and things to think through as you continue in your career, whether you're already working in cybersecurity or you're trying to get into cybersecurity. But one thing that's definitely true is cybersecurity is a national security issue. That's why we've seen, especially in the last couple of years, national strategies come out for cybersecurity, for AI, for privacy. We're seeing organizations really start to get aligned and start resourcing cybersecurity because they realize how important this is. And you all are on the front lines of this. And understanding how to protect systems, how to monitor them, how to prevent attacks, how to detect them is so critical to be able to help the nation. And it's even, you might think, well, who wants to hack my little company I work for or the city I work in or wherever? But sometimes we see adversaries find a vulnerable system in one area and then bounce off of that to somewhere else. We see this especially in things like the supply chain and the defense industrial base. So you think of like the F-35 program and these huge companies like Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman or others that they've got really tight cybersecurity.
Okay. Yeah,
But
quite a
then
bit soon.
they have smaller companies that provide them with parts to what they're building. So it could be a little mom and pop shop somewhere that provides a specific component to the F-35, let's say. And that small mom and pop shop has no cybersecurity whatsoever. This is one thing that some standards coming out, like the CMMC and others, are meant to address, but it's going to be a long time before it gets there. So adversaries understand the supply chain. They go after the small businesses, they compromise them, and then they do something like business email compromise, where now they're in a trusted vendor. And so they work their way up the chain to get to the big people. This is one of those things that just reminds us that every single organization has a role to play in cybersecurity and defending themselves against adversarial attacks. The other thing I just want to get you to think about a little bit is this graphic, I think, is kind of interesting. I actually created this with AI to help drive this point home. But imagine if we told the local police department, hey, if the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans, whoever our adversary is, if they attack your city, you local police department, it's on you. You need to defend the town from the Army, the Navy, the Air Force of our adversaries. Obviously, we would never do that. But that's exactly what we're asking our cyber defenders to do. Because now we have organizations that have no cybersecurity at all, or cybersecurity is a collateral duty, or they do have one or two people in cyber, or maybe they have a whole team. But still, they are all being asked to defend their tiny or large network against all of these nation state sponsored adversaries that are coming after the US and all of our organizations for a variety of reasons. You might think, well, why? Because sometimes we know we have attribution which countries are doing different things. You might think, well, why are they interested in our healthcare information or security clearance information or financial information? But if you think about it, if you have the ability to pull all of that data together from healthcare, from financials, from the government, well, what kind of dossier could you create on individuals? And you never know when that might be helpful. Maybe to upset the political process, to have blackmail against somebody. It could be to sow discord and misinformation and all sorts of things. So sometimes we don't always know why they're coming after the information, but we do know they are coming after it. And so all of us have a really important role to play, and we definitely have to do things the right way and take it seriously, because we do have a small police department up against an entire military of a country sometimes in the cyber world. So what can you do when it comes to all these different things that I've mentioned and just in general in cybersecurity? These are just some things that I've certainly learned over my couple of decades doing this and have helped other people with, and I just put it on a slide to talk through it. But One thing I think is really important is you can raise the cybersecurity awareness and maturity of your organization. Our users are the ones clicking links, not always necessarily intentionally, but they're doing it. They're clicking links, they're using Dropbox when it's not approved by the company, they're logging into things they shouldn't be doing on their work computer. The more we can help spread information about cybersecurity, but more importantly, why they should care about cybersecurity, I think the better it makes all of us and the less work really we have to do doing things that we shouldn't have to do, because if they just would have known about basic cyber hygiene, they wouldn't have done what they did. Also, be agile. Try things, see if it works, make adjustments, and move on. Sometimes I see people get really black and white about things, and in the time that they're unable to move on, they've been hacked or something bad happened. So one thing about cybersecurity, you definitely want to have agility. Also, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. An 80% solution today is definitely better than a 100% solution next year. And I see this happen a lot in cyber where people say, I'm just not going to do that now because next year we're going to buy this wonderful product that's going to fix this problem for us. Or, yeah, I know it does 3 out of my 4 requirements, but based on our project management policy, we have to have the requirements met before it can be deployed. Be really careful of that because the 80% solution might block the problem that you have coming toward you. Also, do something. The saying you cannot steer a parked car is completely correct. Don't suffer from analysis paralysis. I see this all the time with people and organizations where they just feel completely overwhelmed. They don't they say, I can't even do an asset inventory because we don't have a system I can put it in. I don't have an application for that. You don't need an application for that. Use Microsoft Excel to get started. Just do something. And I see people just wait for a long time and never do anything other than admiring problems. And in the meantime, their network is Swiss cheese. Stay up to date on what's going on. As cyber professionals, it is such a quickly evolving field and all the new things that are coming out and things we have to keep up on. It can definitely be overwhelming, but you should do your best to figure out what's going on. Have some resources that you go to even if you're just skimming headlines, just to kind of know what's going on is always important. Also, remember the basics. Just regular blocking and tackling is still important. We have to do it. And use some sort of framework to assess yourself and prioritize improvements. So whether you use the CIS controls, being a former CIS senior vice president, I can tell you I'm pretty partial to them, but the NIST CSF or the CPGs or ISO or any other standards pretty close to being the same, but just pick one and start assessing your organization against them. You got to start somewhere, and that can really help you prioritize your order of things that you need to improve on. Also, learn business and communication skills. One area I coach a lot of CISOs on and other cybersecurity leaders is understanding the business, because you may be a whiz at cybersecurity, but if you then can't take that information and talk to the director, the city council, the city manager, the president of the company, it's not really doing anybody any good. You have to understand how to translate the cybersecurity technical information to the business and risk and items that your boss and your boss's boss care about. So you need to know what's most important to the people that you are protecting as part of your job. And then also take care of yourself. This can be a stressful job. You can feel like if I take a day off, I don't know who's going to do what, who's going to respond to this or do that. We have a backlog. I get all that. I've been there before, but it's not healthy and it doesn't help anybody if you're totally burned out. So make sure that you take care of yourself and you take your time off and you relax and recuperate when you can. And then make sure when you're at work, you're giving it 100%, because we all need you to be doing that. A couple other mindset things that I'll just leave you with. One is the thought that prevention is ideal, but detection is a must. And what I mean by that is we do want to do everything we can to prevent cyber attacks. We have layered defense or defense in depth. We've got all these technologies and tools and procedures that we do, which are great, but it isn't always possible to keep the adversaries out, especially if they're already on the inside. What we also want to focus on is detecting them. Take that dwell time I said about a year and shorten that down to as quick as you can. So when something goes on in your network, because you have all these basic cyber hygiene things in place, you then can detect it or somehow get notified that something's going on to go look at it. Because if you just put all your eggs in the basket of, well, I have a firewall and an intrusion prevention system, I should be good. Hate to break it to you, but that's not going to be enough. So make sure you've got detection capabilities dialed in as much as you can. The second thing I would say is assume the adversary is already in your network. So detection is ideal, or prevention is ideal, detection is a must. Assume the adversary is already in your network. This goes to the whole concept of zero trust network architecture, which the name is a little bit of a misnomer, but basically you have to assume that there's already evil going on in your network and have that mindset when you think about setting systems up, putting tools in place. If you're large enough to have a threat hunt team, how you're coming up with your threat hunt hypotheses and what you're doing to try and find potential adversarial activity inside the network that other tool didn't already catch. So you just always want to be thinking in the back of your mind, okay, when I set this up, if I already have an adversary inside, how am I going to either keep them out of this or get a detection, some sort of alert event if they get into or try and get into whatever it is I'm trying to do. And then finally, the next thing I would say is a little bit of a mind shift change on, and this is great for executives too. I use this a lot when I brief boards, is I'll say, you got to stop asking, are we safe? Because the answer really is no, nobody's safe against cyber attacks. If someone is motivated and resourced to come after your organization, it doesn't really even matter how great of a cyber team you have or how much money you're spending on cyber, they are going to find a way to get in. Instead, the question that really should be asked is, are we prepared? So it's one of those, it's not if, but when is the right mindset to have. That's why incident response plans and retainers and tabletop exercises and policies and procedures and the right tooling are so important. So when that cyber attack does happen, everybody, no one's going to like it, but everybody should be somewhat prepared to deal with it and at least know what everybody's roles and responsibilities and capabilities are. And with that, I'll turn it over to any questions that you all may have while we have some time left together. I also just wanted to say, here's my contact information. If me or my company can ever do anything for you, please reach out. My email address is on the slide. I'll leave this up, as well as my website. And then if you want to connect on LinkedIn, I would definitely invite you to do so. I post a lot about cybersecurity events and activities going on. So if you don't currently have a source for stay up to date, like I mentioned earlier, that might be one of them that you could use to stay up to date on cyber activity. So again, thank you all very much for your time. Thank you to WGU for having me here today. And RJ, I saw you came off of on your camera there, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so and we already do have a few questions coming in. I will tell you, Josh, a few of the comments was this presentation was just absolutely fantastic. One of the most informative presentations that we've had. So thank you for doing that. Reminder to everybody before I start reading off some of the questions, this session was recorded, so this will be sent out. So if you do want to go back and reference anything, certainly do that. First question for you, Josh. Fantastic presentation. Thank you for taking the time to do this. My question for you is, what concept of cybersecurity do you believe is the hardest to get clients to understand in your time in the field?
I think the hardest concept is just getting clients to understand that they really are a target, no matter what industry vertical they're in or what size, and just trying to get them to understand that. And then also how, kind of part two to that, but it's somewhat related, is I have a lot of clients that say, well, I have an IT person, they've got this handled. And a lot of times, no disrespect to our IT colleagues, because they have their expertise, but generally it's not security. So trying to get them to understand that that's great, your systems are working, but they're probably not secured adequately enough. So you still need to have some cybersecurity reviews being done.
Awesome. Next question, is there a path or resources you suggest students look into to break into this sector in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I teach for a couple of universities, and I get this same question from many of my students as well. And it is a challenge because you see on one hand there's 500,000 or 700,000 open cybersecurity jobs at any one time, and then you also see people saying, "I cannot find a job. I've got a degree, I've got certifications, or whatever." One of the problems that we see is that there's a little bit of a misnomer of cybersecurity entry level positions, generally because cybersecurity is looked at as a specialty by a lot of organizations. So it's kind of like the difference between a general practitioner physician and a surgeon. You don't go to your PCP for open heart surgery, you go to a cardiologist. And it's a little bit like that, where sometimes the best route to get into cybersecurity that I have found is starting in IT, actually. So even if you're going to school for cyber, see if you can get a help desk job or something like that, or a system administrator job to get into an organization, especially if you're targeting an organization to work in. It's easier sometimes to get into one of those roles, work there for a year or two, and then promote up internally as a lateral candidate into the cybersecurity team. When I was a CIO, I hired a lot of my cyber team from the IT side of the house, unless I was looking for a really experienced person that already had experience somewhere else. So that's one potential avenue. But if you're going to WGU and getting a degree and the certifications that come with it, you're already doing a great amount of work. Also, look for internships. There's lots of companies out there that have paid internships in cyber, which can help you get some of that experience you need too.
Awesome. Next question. What are your thoughts on AI security?
AI is really interesting from a number of areas. I think it's as helpful as it is terrifying. I think that from for just a general practitioner cybersecurity standpoint, the biggest challenge we all have is not having our employees uploading a bunch of proprietary information to ChatGPT or Google Gemini or whoever, and having that leave our control. And who knows where it's going, especially on free accounts where there's no expectation of privacy in many of those things. So I think that's a really big challenge for us. I think there's some great opportunities for us too from the cyber defense side and pen testing side that I've seen with AI. With security specifically, I also think phishing emails are a game changer already. We used to teach people to look for grammatical errors and look for poor sentence structure and all of this stuff. That's no longer an issue because somebody can put in to chat gpt a draft email and a perfectly formatted grammatically correct email comes out and they send that instead. So definitely seeing things like that. And then also on the mis and disinformation front, where we're seeing AI being used to in bots and other things to create misinformation is a big challenge too. That deep fakes and things like that. That authenticating messages from a cybersecurity perspective are all things coming down the road for us that are going to be challenging.
Awesome. And we're about 5 minutes out here, so I do see a bunch of questions coming in. So we'll answer as many as we can. Next one is with this sector being so niche, are there skills you best suggest focusing on building?
Well, that's a good question. I would say cybersecurity has primarily three major buckets. You got cyber defense, so the blue team kind of activities, forensics, incident response. We've got cyber offense, red team type things, penetration testing, vulnerability management. And then you've got more of the GRC policy, governance, risk, compliance policy, which is a little bit more on the administrative side. So at some point, you have to pick kind of the niche that you want to go into and get those specific skills. But there's a couple things just across the board that really successful cyber people are able to possess. One is the communication skills that I mentioned before, being able to present, being able to articulate technical topics to a non-technical audience, being able to write well is very important no matter what your role is. Almost every cyber role has some either policy development or report writing requirement to it. So that's really a helpful trait to have. Obviously, being a good team player is really important. Being a good leader, even if you're not an official leader, but also being a good follower and setting an example is important as well. And those, I think, cut across all aspects. A couple other things too. I think understanding just basic technology and IT, sometimes we get really focused in cybersecurity, especially like in digital forensics, where that's primarily where I started in. But unless you're on the incident response side of the house, you may not understand networking at all. So just having I think that's one thing WGU does a really good job in, is hitting all of those things. So maybe you're a mile wide, but only an inch deep, but that's okay because at least you know a little bit about a lot of things until you pick your niche. So those are some things I would say would be important to know.
Awesome. And Josh, I don't know if you can see the comments coming in, but some fantastic comments just on the presentation overall. So again,
Thanks.
I do want to thank you for jumping on. Next question that came in: what are some valuable niches?
Some valuable, well, I think a couple things, especially now, you might want to consider if you're really thinking about going into cyber and you want to stand out a bit. AI would certainly be one of them. I think if you were good at prompt engineering and securing AI type of infrastructure and systems and understanding the privacy implications, that could be really great. I think cloud actually is another area that still a lot of people are having a difficult time understanding. How do you secure Google Workspace? How do you secure Microsoft 365? How do you set up logging in Chronicle or Sentinel or Splunk? So knowing, being very good at cloud computing and AWS, GCP, Oracle, Azure from a cybersecurity perspective, that's one thing you can really write your own ticket if you've got that stuff nailed. So those are the first few things that come to mind.
Awesome. And we'll take one more question for Josh. Question came in: what kind of roles might be available for someone with 6 to 7 years of network engineer or years as a network engineer with certs such as CYSA plus? And I apologize because I am not a cyber person. And OSCP.
Mhm.
Have you seen anyone be able to skip over the SOC role and go directly to the red teaming or security engineering with similar credentials?
Yes. So a couple things that would immediately come to mind with that kind of a background would be network security architecture. So where you're helping organizations design their network, but from a security standpoint, so where to put their firewalls, both for network segmentation internally and their perimeter firewalls, how to set up intrusion detection and prevention systems, how to do full packet capture and network monitoring, and just architecting those solutions. Also, from the pen testing side, vulnerability management, scanning, and then actual pen testing, there would certainly be roles because, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes networking is not the strongest suit of people in cyber. So if you already have a great networking background, you can be really valuable from a red team perspective. So I have certainly seen people jump from IT to higher levels in cyber and not having to go through a traditional, well, there's really not a lot of traditional paths, but you don't have to be a SOC analyst first by any means. You could look for those mid-level cyber jobs in that specific area like pen testing.
Awesome. From there, what we'll do, we will wrap up. First, Josh, thank you again. This was fantastic. Some of the comments I think are pretty evident how valuable this information has been.
Great.
So we thank you for taking the time, coming back, speaking to both our students, alumni, both live and those that will go back and watch this recording. So first, thank you for doing that for us. And then just a reminder to everybody, the session was recorded. So if you want to go back and reference anything that Josh covered throughout the presentation, feel free to go back and do that. Also attached to the email communication, which will go out probably tomorrow morning, is a questionnaire. We just ask that you take the time, fill that out. We value your opinion as students and alum. So please go back and fill that out. Should take you no more than 2 minutes. And then for those of you that if this was your first session for Cyber Week, thank you for joining us. And then those that this might have been their third or fourth one, we appreciate you jumping in. But thank you again, Josh. Fantastic information. And thank you everyone for joining us today. All right. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone.